They pushed her off of the cliff, laughed as she disappeared over the edge. No scream, no struggle, just the sound of boots kicking gravel and silence. They thought that was it. No ropes, no backup, no chance, just a drop steep enough to erase a body and a witness. But what they didn't know was that Navy SEALs don't need ropes to climb. Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Alex Morgan felt the hands on her back a half second before they made contact. Not the casual brush of a teammate steadying her on the narrow ridge, but the deliberate, forceful thrust of someone intending harm. Her muscles tensed instinctively, combat reflexes firing, but physics had already claimed her body. Gravity pulled her forward and down away from the solid Sierra Nevada ridge, where seconds before she'd been scanning the horizon for their next checkpoint. Time slowed as she fell. The mountain air rushing past her face carried the distinct scent of pine and wet stone. Her brain, trained through thousands of hours of combat situations, remained oddly calm, processing details with crystalline clarity. The jagged outcroppings of granite flashing by. The gradual rotation of her body as she tumbled. The voices above growing distant, but not panicked, not shouting for help or throwing down ropes. Just satisfied murmurs and a single laugh quickly stifled. This wasn't an accident. It was an execution. 15 years of SEAL training took over. Her arms extended outward, fingers spread like claws, searching for any purchase against the cliff face. Her right hand slammed against an outcropping flesh, tearing against stone, as she desperately clutched at the mountain. Pain shot up her arm as her shoulder absorbed the full momentum of her falling body. Something cracked in her chest ribs, giving way, but her grip held. For 3 agonizing seconds, she hung suspended, blood already streaming down her temple from where her head had struck rock. Her legs dangled over a void that dropped another 150 feet into darkness. One slip, one muscle spasm, and gravity would finish what her supposed allies had started. "Well, damn, that was cleaner than I thought," a voice drifted down from above. Jackson Frost, former Delta Force operator, now head of Black Hawk Defense's Special Training Division. The man who had been walking behind her. "Thinks she's dead," another voice. Cooper, the communications specialist. "She will be. Ain't nobody climbing back up from that without a rope." Boots shuffled on loose stone, then silence. They weren't even bothering to look over the edge to confirm the kill. Arrogance, overconfidence, fatal mistakes in her line of work. Alex pulled in a breath that tasted of copper and dust. Blood trickled into her left eye, but her vision remained clear in the right. She surveyed her position with the detachment of a tactician rather than a victim. Suspended 15 feet below the ridgeline, clinging to an outcropping barely wider than her forearm. Below her, the cliff dropped away in a near vertical face, disappearing into shadow and pine trees. The ledge she clung to wasn't stable already. Small pieces of stone were breaking away under her grip, but she wasn't going to die here. Not like this. "They picked the wrong SEAL to kill," she whispered to the mountain. 3 days earlier, the mission had seemed straightforward enough. A joint training exercise in the Sierra Nevada mountains, rugged terrain that had been used for specialized military training since the Cold War. Lieutenant Commander Alex Morgan, one of the first women to complete SEAL training, and now a respected team leader, would work alongside contractors from Black Hawk Defense to assess new extreme environment protocols. Standard cross-training between active military and private security. On paper, it was routine. The 4-man Black Hawk team had met them at the forward base camp with the usual mix of respect and skepticism that greeted female operators. Jackson Frost, their leader, had sized her up with eyes that had seen action in Iraq, Afghanistan, and a dozen classified operations. At 48, his face was a topographical map of hard living, with a scar running from his right temple to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from a close encounter with an insurgent's blade, according to base rumors. "Lieutenant Commander Morgan," he'd said, not quite making it a question. "Heard you broke the sniper course record at Dam Neck." Alex had nodded, once professional, but not defensive. "Just doing my job, Mr. Frost." His team filled out the typical private military profile. Elliot Cooper, communications specialist, former Signal Corps, with a reputation for being able to get a message through from anywhere on Earth. Ryan Miller, weapons expert, young but competent, with the eager energy of someone still with something to prove. Thomas Reed, logistics and heavy equipment. All of them built like oak trees with the hyper-vigilant eyes of men who'd seen combat and expected to see it again. The first day had gone by the book. Equipment checks, mission parameters, route planning. Standard operating procedure with just a hint of the familiar tension that came when military and contractors mixed. But Alex had noticed small things, glances exchanged when they thought she wasn't looking. An unusual number of satellite phone calls that Cooper made outside the command tent, extra crates that weren't on the manifest loaded with equipment under tarps that no one discussed. Just before sunset on that first day, she'd made a call of her own, stepping away from the camp to an outcropping of rocks that gave her privacy and better signal strength. The connection had taken longer than it should have, bouncing through secure military satellites before finally connecting. Morgan thought you'd be halfway up a mountain by now. The graveled voice of Colonel William Bill Hayes, her former commander and mentor, came through with the familiar mix of gruffness and concern that had defined their relationship since her earliest days at Budzari's training. At 68, Hayes was the old guard, a decorated SEAL who'd seen action from the Gulf War through to the War on Terror before retiring to train the next generation. He'd been one of the few senior officers who hadn't just tolerated her presence in the program, but had actively championed it, recognizing in her the same unyielding determination he valued in any operator, regardless of gender. "Something's off with this mission, sir," she'd said, keeping her voice low. "Black Hawk team is running side communications carrying extra hardware. Mission parameters don't match what I was briefed on at Norfolk." Hayes had been silent for a moment, the kind of silence that comes before carefully chosen words. "Listen to me carefully, Morgan. I've been hearing things about Black Hawk. Nothing concrete, nothing I could take up the chain, but enough to make me uncomfortable. Word is they've got friends in places that matter, and enemies in places that should matter more. You think this isn't a standard cross-training? I think you need to watch your six." The concern in his voice had deepened. "If anything feels wrong, truly wrong, you abort. That's an order. You know that's not how I operate, sir." A sigh had crackled through the connection. "No, it isn't. Which is why I had something sent with your personal gear. Check the inside pocket of your climbing harness. Swedish design looks like a standard carabiner, but it's actually a SATCOM tracker. Old tech from back in my day, but they can't scan for it because nobody uses the frequency anymore." Alex had felt her eyebrows rise. "Is that even legal, sir?" "Legal enough to keep you alive if things go sideways. Morgan, I've buried too many good operators. I'm not adding you to that list." That conversation had left her unsettled, but not enough to abort. SEALs didn't walk away from missions based on hunches, even ones from respected commanders. But she'd found the device exactly where Hayes said it would be, an innocuous-looking piece of climbing gear that concealed a sophisticated emergency beacon. She'd clipped it to her harness, hoping it was just Hayes being overprotective. By the second day, as they pushed deeper into the mountains, the subtle wrongness had grown more pronounced. Their route had changed 3 times, always moving them further from established training zones and deeper into isolated terrain. Cooper's satellite calls had increased in frequency and decreased in transparency. That evening, during equipment checks, Alex had noticed something else. The serial numbers on some of Black Hawk's gear didn't follow standard military or even private contractor patterns. They were using hardware that wasn't just off-book, it was ghost gear, the kind that couldn't be traced back to any legitimate source. "Something on your mind, Commander." Frost had appeared beside her with the silent movement that reminded her he'd once been one of the best in the business. "Just wondering why our route keeps changing," she'd replied evenly. "We're 30 miles off the original training grid now." Frost had smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. "Better terrain features out here. More realistic for the kind of work your teams might be doing overseas. Unless you're not up for the challenge." The bait was obvious, the condescension barely concealed. Alex had encountered it throughout her career, the implicit suggestion that as a woman she might not be capable of handling the physical demands. She'd learned long ago not to rise to it. "I've operated in every terrain from Arctic ice to Kandahar dust storms, Mr. Frost. I'm not concerned about my capabilities." Her eyes had locked with his. "I'm concerned about mission parameters changing without proper authorization." Something had flickered across his face, then not just annoyance, but calculation. "Everything's been cleared through Command Commander Morgan. Maybe you should worry less about paperwork and more about keeping up tomorrow. We've got a technical climb that separates the real operators from the ones who just look good in the uniform." That night, unable to sleep, she'd made her way silently to the edge of camp, intending to try another call to Hayes. What she'd found instead was Cooper hunched over a communications setup that wasn't standard issue anything, a compact, high-powered system with encryption capabilities well beyond what a training mission would require. She'd pressed herself against the shadow of a boulder, listening as he spoke in hushed tones. Confirm Orpheus is on schedule. Package arrives at 0600. A pause. Now, she doesn't suspect anything, just the usual officer bullshit, asking questions because she can. Frost is handling it. Another pause. Once we get to the ridge tomorrow, won't be an issue anymore. Alex had slipped away before being detected, heart pounding, not with fear, but with the cold clarity that comes with confirmation. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't Hayes being overprotective. Something was very wrong, and it centered on whatever Orpheus was, and apparently she was a problem that needed solving. Back in her tent, she'd composed an encrypted message to her commanding officer, Brigadier Richards, outlining her concerns and requesting immediate extraction. The response had come back almost suspiciously quickly. Continue mission. Your concerns noted but not sufficient to abort. Complete training as planned. Richards out. Too quick. Too dismissive. Either Richards didn't believe her or the thought had sent ice through her veins. Richards was somehow connected to whatever was happening. With no backup coming and surrounded by a team she now knew meant her harm, Alex had done what SEALs do, adapted, improvised, and prepared for combat. She'd concealed a K-bar knife in her boot, in addition to her standard-issue blade. She'd replaced the batteries in Hayes' tracking device, and she'd mentally prepared for the possibility that the next day might require her to fight her way out. What she hadn't prepared for was being pushed off a cliff before she could act. The morning had started with an abrupt change in plans. Instead of the scheduled rappelling exercise at a designated training phase, Frost had led them to an isolated ridge with a sheer drop on one side. Change of plans, he'd announced, consulting a topo map that Alex suspected was just for show. We're going to work on free climbing techniques at the north face. More challenging, more realistic for real-world operations. The location was perfect for an accident. Remote, dangerous, natural. A place where a slip and fall would raise no questions, especially with 4 witnesses all telling the same story about the female SEAL who'd been in over her head. As they'd approached the narrow section of ridge that ran alongside a sheer drop, Alex had felt the change in the air, not just the thinner oxygen of altitude, but the tension of men preparing to act. Frost had maneuvered to walk behind her with Cooper and Reed flanking to prevent any escape to the sides. Miller had been positioned ahead, moving with the stiff coordination of someone fighting nervous energy. She'd been ready to make her move when Frost's hands had slammed into her back with the full force of his 200-pound frame, sending her not just over the edge, but outward away from any easy handholds. You know too much about Orpheus already. Cooper had called down in a tone that suggested finality. Now dangling from the cliff face with blood in her eyes and fire in her ribs, Lieutenant Commander Alex Morgan faced the reality of her situation with cold calculation. The Black Hawk team thought she was dead or dying. They wouldn't be back to check. Her official chain of command was either compromised or indifferent. No help would come from above. Her only option was to climb, not just to survive, but to find out what Orpheus was and why it was worth killing a decorated Navy SEAL to protect. She tested her limbs systematically. Right arm functional but strained at the shoulder, left arm intact, right leg strong, left leg responsive but with a deep gash across the thigh that was already soaking her cargo pants with blood. Ribs cracked on the right side, sending shards of pain with each breath. Head injury superficial, but bleeding freely as all scalp wounds did. Not ideal, but not fatal. She reached down to her belt with her free hand, finding her climbing utility pouch still intact. Inside was a length of paracord, not enough for a full climbing rope, but sufficient for impromptu harnesses and safety backups. Her radio was smashed beyond repair from the impact with the cliff face. The small SATCOM device from Hayes was still clipped to her belt, seemingly undamaged. She pressed its activation button twice, sending out the prearranged distress signal. Whether anyone would receive it or respond in time was another question entirely. First things first, stabilize, orient, ascend. Basic SEAL doctrine for any survival situation. Alex secured a makeshift harness around her waist, using the paracord anchoring it to the outcropping that had saved her life. The temporary security allowed her to better assess the cliff face around her. The granite was weathered but solid, with enough irregularities to provide potential handholds. The real question was whether her injured body could make the climb. A memory surfaced her second week of Bud's training, the notorious SEAL qualification course, that broke even the strongest candidates. She'd been halfway up a training cliff when her instructor had cut her safety line, leaving her dangling 30 feet above the ground. "A SEAL climbs with or without a rope, Morgan," he'd bellowed from below. "What are you, equipment or operator?" She hadn't answered then. She'd just climbed, fingers, bleeding muscles, screaming until she'd reached the top and thrown herself over the edge onto solid ground. Later, she'd learned the instructor had been Bill Hayes, testing her not out of malice, but because he'd seen something in her that reminded him of himself. "Equipment fails," he'd told her afterward, handing her a canteen. "Plans fail, bodies fail, but will doesn't unless you let it." Now, 15 years later, hanging from a cliff in the Sierra Nevadas with multiple injuries and no backup, she heard his voice again in her mind. "Equipment fails, plans fail, bodies fail, but will doesn't unless you let it." Alex began to search the cliff face methodically, looking not just for the next handhold, but for a pattern. This part of the mountains had been used for military training for decades. There would be established routes, possibly even old hardware embedded in the stone from previous exercises. Sure enough, about 3 feet to her left, nearly invisible beneath a crust of dirt and lichen, was a rusted bolt anchor, the kind used in military climbing exercises from the 1970s and 80s. Another was visible about 8 feet above it. These weren't random. They formed a vertical path up the cliff face, a ghost route left behind by operators long since retired or dead. Alex felt a grim smile form on her bloodied lips. The mountain remembered what Black Hawk had forgotten: these training grounds had been forging warriors since before Frost was born. And now those long-gone instructors were reaching through time to offer her a lifeline. She began to climb using the old bolts as primary anchor points, while testing each natural handhold before committing her weight. Each movement sent fresh pain through her ribs and shoulder. Blood from her head wound kept threatening to blind her left eye, forcing her to pause every few feet to wipe it away with her sleeve. 20 feet up. 30. The old bolt pattern continued, though some anchors had rusted away completely or pulled partially from the stone, requiring her to make dangerous traverses across sections of bare cliff. Each time her boots slipped or a handhold crumbled, her heart slammed against her injured ribs, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Halfway up the cliff face, she found a narrow ledge just wide enough to perch on and rest. Her breathing came in controlled, shallow gasps to minimize the pain in her ribs. Her gloves were torn through palms, lacerated and bleeding. The gash on her thigh had finally stopped bleeding, the fabric of her pants now stiff with drying blood. Alex looked up, another 30 feet to the ridgeline. The sun was beginning to dip toward the western peaks, taking with it vital light and warmth. If she didn't make the top before dusk, her chances of survival would plummet along with the temperature. As she prepared to continue the climb, a sound drifted down from above voices. Black Hawk was still on the ridge. She froze, pressing herself against the cliff, face listening. "Need to move the schedule up. If there's any chance she survived." She didn't survive. It's a 200-foot drop onto rocks. No one walks away from that. Then why did we get that burst transmission on the secure channel? A pause. Whoa, could be automated. Some of these military systems send distress signals when they detect impact damage. And if it's not automated, if she somehow, then we find her and finish it properly. But right now we need to focus on Orpheus. The package is inbound, and we need to be at the reception point in 3 hours. The voices moved away, leaving Alex with two vital pieces of information. Her distress signal had been detected, though misattributed to equipment failure. And whatever Orpheus was, it was happening soon at a location close enough that they could reach it within 3 hours. She resumed climbing with renewed purpose, no longer just fighting for survival, but racing against time to uncover whatever operation was worth killing for. The final 15 feet were the hardest. The old bolt pattern ended, leaving her with only natural handholds on increasingly weathered stone. Her muscles trembled with fatigue, her fingers so numb she had to visually confirm her grip. But inch by inch, she closed the distance to the ridgeline. As the last light of day painted the Sierra Nevada in gold and crimson, Lieutenant Commander Alex Morgan pulled herself over the edge of the cliff and rolled onto solid ground. For 1 minute, she allowed herself to lie there, chest heaving, body screaming, staring up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Then, with the discipline that had carried her through SEAL training and combat zones across the world, she pushed herself to her feet and took stock of her surroundings. The ridge extended in both directions, with the eastern path leading back toward their original camp and the western fork curving around the mountain toward what appeared to be a shallow valley. From her elevated position, she could make out unnatural lights in that valley. Not campfires, but the steady glow of powered illumination. Some kind of forward operating base where there shouldn't be one. Alex moved cautiously along the ridge toward a cluster of boulders that would provide both cover and a better vantage point. Each step was deliberate, her boots making no sound on the loose stone. Blood had dried on her face in a mask that would serve as improvised camouflage in the growing darkness. From the shelter of the boulders, she used the fading light to study the valley below. What she saw confirmed her worst suspicions. The Black Hawk team had established not a training camp, but a full operational staging area. Military-grade cargo containers were arranged in a defensive perimeter. Armed men more than just the four she'd been with patrolled the edges. Floodlights illuminated a cleared central area where a helipad had been marked out with chemical lights. Most concerning of all were the crates. Stacked neatly near the helipad were shipping containers bearing the distinctive markings of M122 transport cases designed for moving heavy weapons and sensitive military hardware. But these didn't have standard military markings. Instead, they bore spray-painted designations: medical relief, water filtration, winter rations, aid cargo markings on military weapons containers. A classic black market technique. As night fell completely, Alex could make out more details through gaps in the camp's lighting. One container stood apart from the others under heavier guard and covered with a specialized tarp designed to defeat thermal imaging. Whatever was in that container was the centerpiece of the operation. She checked the SATCOM device again. No response to her distress signal. Either Hayes hadn't received it or he couldn't get help to her location in time. She was on her own, injured, outmanned, and outgunned. But she also had the element of surprise. They thought she was dead, which meant she was now a ghost, the most dangerous thing an operator could become. Moving silently back from her observation point, Alex found a sheltered depression in the rocks, where she could assess her remaining resources and form a plan. The tactical situation was dire but not hopeless. She had her K-bar knife, about 20 feet of paracord, a multi-tool, 2 protein bars from her pocket, and a half-filled water bottle that had somehow survived the fall. Most importantly, she had her training and the absolute certainty that whatever Black Hawk was doing involved betrayal at the highest levels. She recalled her Naval Academy instructor's words on asymmetric warfare. When outmanned and outgunned become the force your enemy least expects and most fears. Right now, Black Hawk feared nothing because they believed their only obstacle was dead at the bottom of a cliff. That gave her an advantage no weapon could provide. Alex formulated her strategy using the SEER principles: survival, evasion, resistance, escape adapted for offensive rather than defensive operations. She would not merely survive. She would gather intelligence on Orpheus, disrupt the operation, and find a way to alert authorities, not compromised by whatever conspiracy she'd stumbled into. As she began to prepare, a flash of movement at the camp caught her attention. Through a gap in the trees, she could see Frost emerging from what appeared to be the command tent. He was speaking into a satellite phone, gesturing emphatically. And then another figure stepped into view, one that made Alex's blood run cold. Brigadier General Richards, her commanding officer, the man who had dismissed her concerns and ordered her to continue the mission. The conspiracy went higher than she'd imagined. Not just private contractors gone rogue, but the active military leadership involved in what was clearly an illegal operation on American soil. As she watched Richards and Frost walk toward the secured container, punched a code into an electronic lock, and slipped inside. Whatever Orpheus was, it was in that container. And now she knew that the betrayal extended into the heart of the chain of command she'd sworn to uphold. Lieutenant Commander Alex Morgan wiped the dried blood from her face with the back of her hand and felt a cold, focused anger replace the pain and fatigue of her injured body. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. This was about the oath she'd taken, the principles she'd devoted her life to defending. "They think they killed a SEAL," she whispered to the darkness. "What they did was unleash one." As night settled fully over the Sierra Nevada, Alex began to move toward the camp, a shadow among shadows, guided by the need for truth and the training that had prepared her for exactly this moment, when everything failed except will itself. The hunt had begun, and this time she wasn't the prey. Pain had a shape now. It throbbed behind Alex's right eye, pulsed in her ribs like a second heartbeat, burned along her left thigh where jagged stone had torn through her combat trousers. But Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Morgan had been hurt before. She'd been dropped from helicopters too low to jump, but too hot to hover. Been waterboarded until she forgot her own name. Been pushed through drills designed to make lesser soldiers fold in less than an hour. Pain didn't stop her. It reminded her she was still in the fight. The night air bit cold against her exposed skin as she moved in silence through the pine-scented darkness. Each step was deliberate, her boot placement instinctive after years of covert operations. From her elevated position above the Black Hawk camp, she could see the entire operational layout, perimeter guards equipment, staging areas, command tent. The confidence of men who believed themselves unseen and unchallenged. Alex assessed her injuries with clinical detachment. 2 cracked ribs on her right side limited deep breathing and rapid movement. The laceration on her thigh had clotted but would reopen with strenuous activity. Her right shoulder was badly strained, reducing her arm's effectiveness by about 40%. Head wound superficial but still seeping blood that required constant attention to prevent impairing her vision. Not ideal for direct confrontation. But ideal wasn't a luxury SEALs expected. She closed her eyes briefly, recalling her father's voice from 20 years ago. They'd been climbing in the Colorado Rockies when she was 15, her first real mountain. No guide, no safety ropes. Just her father and the unforgiving stone face rising before them. She'd slipped on a patch of ice near the summit, panic freezing her in place as her boots scrabbled for purchase. "I can't do it. Dad," she'd called up to him, fingers white-knuckled on a thin ledge. He hadn't reached down to help, hadn't offered platitudes or encouragement. He'd just looked at her with eyes weathered by 30 years of military service and said, "Cliffs aren't walls, Alex. They're tests, and they only stop the people who stop themselves." At the time, she'd thought it was just something fathers said to keep their daughters moving. Now she understood the deeper truth. The mountain was indifferent to her pain, her fear, her limitations. It simply existed, impassive and unchanging. The only variable in the equation was her will. The mountain before her now wasn't granite. It was betrayal, corruption, and the dark machinery of whatever Orpheus represented. But the principle remained the same. It would only stop her if she stopped herself. Alex began her descent toward the camp, moving from shadow to shadow with the fluid grace of a predator. The rough terrain that would have challenged most operators felt familiar under her boots. She'd trained in these mountains, knew their contours and whispers. The earth here remembered the tread of warriors long before Black Hawk's mercenaries arrived with their cargo containers and blood money. Halfway down the slope, she found what she was looking for, a natural depression, sheltered by overhanging rock, invisible from below, but offering a clear line of sight to the camp's eastern perimeter. A perfect observation post. She settled into position, ignoring the fresh stab of pain from her ribs, and extracted her remaining operational assets. The Ka-Bar knife gleamed dully in the moonlight, 7 inches of carbon steel that had accompanied her through 3 combat deployments. The paracord now partially used for her makeshift climbing harness, a multi-tool with pliers, wire cutters, and screwdrivers. Not much, but in trained hands sufficient. She focused her attention on the camp below, watching patrol patterns, noting guard rotations. 2-man teams, 30-minute circuits, standard private military protocol, but executed with sloppiness born of overconfidence. The command tent remained illuminated silhouettes moving behind canvas walls. One container in particular drew her focus, larger than the others, positioned centrally within the camp's defensive perimeter under both physical and electronic security measures. Whatever Orpheus was, it lived in that container. As she watched, the container's heavy door swung open. Light spilled out, briefly illuminating Frost's weathered face and Richard's ramrod-straight posture as they emerged. Behind them, visible for just a moment before the door closed, was something unexpected. Not weapons crates or military hardware, but what appeared to be computer servers. Advanced technology, not crude armaments. Alex's mind raced through possibilities. Secure communications, electronic warfare systems, intelligence gathering equipment. All valuable on the black market, but none seemed to justify the elaborate operation or the attempted murder of a decorated naval officer. She needed more information. The camp had begun to quiet as midnight approached. Frost and Richards had retired to separate tents after issuing what appeared to be final orders for the night. Guard patrols continued, but with the reduced alertness that comes with routine and fatigue. Now was the time to move. Alex descended further using the natural terrain for cover. A dry creek bed provided a concealed approach to within 50 meters of the perimeter. Close enough to observe but not engage intelligence gathering remained her priority. Direct confrontation against superior numbers with her injuries would be suicidal. From her new position, she could hear fragments of conversation between the closest guard pair. Confirmed delivery at 0400. After that, we're ghosts. Whole operation seems excessive for some computer gear. That computer gear is worth more than you'll make in 10 lifetimes. Besides, you don't get paid to understand Orpheus. You get paid to secure it. A pause then. Still can't believe Frost actually pushed her off. Cold man. She was DevGru. Would you rather go toe-to-toe with her besides clean accident on a training exercise? No investigation, no questions. The casual dismissal of her life ignited something cold and focused in Alex's chest. These weren't soldiers following misguided orders. These were mercenaries, men who had abandoned honor for profit. She continued gathering information, piecing together fragments of conversation and visual data. The operation appeared to be in its final stages. A helicopter was expected before dawn, likely to transport whatever technology was in the central container. After that, the entire camp would disperse evidence, buried witnesses eliminated. Her window for action was closing. A flash of movement near the command tent caught her attention. Cooper, the communications specialist, emerged with a satellite phone pressed to his ear. His expression was tense, body language agitated. I understand, sir. Yes, the problem has been eliminated. A pause. No, sir, we haven't confirmed the body, but there's no way she survived the fall. Another pause, longer this time. Yes, sir, I'll inform Frost immediately. Cooper hurried toward Frost's tent, moving with the urgency of someone bearing unwelcome news. Whatever had been said on that call had disrupted the operation's carefully maintained calm. Alex seized the opportunity. With attention focused on Cooper's news, a gap had appeared in the perimeter security. She moved like a ghost, crossing the open ground between her position and the camp's edge in a low, swift crawl that kept her below the line of sight of the distracted guards. Inside the perimeter, she pressed herself against the shadow of a supply crate, controlling her breathing despite the fire in her ribs. 20 feet away, Cooper had emerged from Frost's tent alongside the Black Hawk commander. Both men looked grim. How the hell did Hayes know? Frost's voice carried in the night air. Unknown, sir, but he's making noise through channels we can't ignore. Says he received a distress signal from Morgan's position. Impossible. She went over the cliff. I watched her fall. Nevertheless, he's convinced she's alive and in trouble. Worse, he's mobilized resources outside the normal chain of command. Old school contacts that don't report through channels we control. Frost swore under his breath. How much time do we have? Hayes is at least 6 hours out, even moving fast. But he's not alone. The revelation sent a surge of hope through Alex. Bill Hayes had received her signal. He was coming. But 6 hours remained an eternity in operational terms, especially with the helicopter, due in less than 4. Frost's next words confirmed her fears. Move up the timetable. I want that container loaded and gone before first light. And send Reed and Miller back to the cliff. I want visual confirmation that Morgan is dead, and I want her body removed from the equation. Cooper nodded sharply and moved toward the communications tent while Frost returned to his quarters. Within minutes, 2 figures emerged from the barracks tent, Reed and Miller geared up for night operations, weapons slung across their chests. They moved toward the perimeter, heading in the direction of the cliff where Alex had been pushed. Her tactical situation had just deteriorated. Not only was the timetable accelerated, but 2 operators were now actively hunting for her. Worse, they would soon discover she wasn't at the bottom of the cliff, alerting the entire camp to her survival. Alex needed to act now, not just to gather intelligence, but to disrupt the operation before the helicopter arrived. She couldn't stop them all, but she could create enough chaos to delay them until Hayes arrived with the reinforcements. Moving deeper into the camp required greater risk. The interior was better lit with more personnel moving between tents and equipment. She used the shadows of cargo containers for cover, freezing in place whenever a patrol passed nearby. Her body protested each movement, but adrenaline and training kept her focused. The command tent stood before her, now its entrance illuminated by a single LED lamp. Through the partial opening in the canvas, she could see maps spread across a folding table, communications equipment arranged along one wall, and a laptop connected to what appeared to be an external hard drive. Intelligence, documentation, evidence. Alex waited for a patrol to pass before sliding into the tent through its rear wall, using her K-bar to create a vertical slit in the heavy canvas. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and cigarettes. She moved directly to the laptop, waking it from sleep mode. The screen prompted for a password. No time for finesse. She disconnected the external drive and slipped it into her cargo pocket. Whatever data it contained might reveal Orpheus's true nature. The maps on the table told another story. One showed the Sierra Nevada region with multiple locations marked not just their current position, but several others scattered across the mountains. Another displayed what appeared to be transportation routes leading from their position to various points across the Mexican border. Not just a black market operation then, an international one. A third map caught her attention, this one showing a military research facility near San Diego. The facility was circled in red with handwritten notes about security patterns and access points. The implications were disturbing. Blackhawk wasn't just selling military equipment, they were stealing it directly from secure installations. Alex quickly photographed the maps with her mind committing key details to memory. She was preparing to exit when voices approached the tent entrance. "Still don't understand why we need to move everything up." Richard's voice irritated and tense. "Because Hayes is a wild card we can't control." Frost's reply came as the tent flap opened. He trained half the Special Operations Command structure currently in place. If he starts asking questions, people listen. Alex pressed herself into the shadows behind a stack of equipment cases. Discovery now would be fatal. "Then we eliminate Hayes too." Richard's tone was matter-of-fact, the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to removing obstacles. "It's not that simple. Hayes is too high profile. His death coming right after Morgan's accident would trigger exactly the kind of investigation we've been avoiding." The two men moved to the central table, their backs to Alex's position. Richards leaned over the maps, tracing a finger along one of the routes. "The cargo moves at 0400 as planned. Our buyers are already en route. We can't delay without compromising the entire operation." "And if Morgan somehow survived," Richard straightened, turning toward Frost with cold eyes, "then find her and finish it properly. One seal won't stop Orpheus. There's too much money involved, too many powerful people invested in its success, and too many bodies already buried." Frost added, his voice revealing a hint of something Alex hadn't expected: regret. Richards noticed it too. "Getting sentimental, Frost. Remember what these people did to you. 16 years of service, 3 Purple Hearts, and they discarded you with a medical discharge and half pension when your usefulness ended. They deserve what's coming. It was never about revenge for me. It was about getting what I earned. Then stay focused on the payday, not the past. When this is done, you'll have enough money to disappear forever. No more contracts, no more wars." As they continued discussing operational details, Alex processed the new information. This wasn't just about selling weapons or technology. It was personal, driven by Frost's bitterness over his treatment by the military establishment. Richards had weaponized that resentment, channeling it into a betrayal with international implications. And Hayes was coming, potentially walking into an ambush if she couldn't warn him. The meeting concluded with Richards exiting the tent while Frost remained examining the maps. Alex was trapped, no way to leave without being seen. Worse, Frost had moved to the equipment stack and was reaching for a case inches from her position. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. Discovery was seconds away. Direct confrontation unavoidable. Then the camp exploded into motion. "Contact at the perimeter," a voice shouted from outside. "Reed and Miller are reporting gunfire at the cliff site." Frost abandoned the equipment and rushed from the tent, shouting orders as he went. "Full alert. Secure the container, Richards, to the command post now." The diversion was unexpected but welcome. Alex slipped out through the same canvas slit she'd entered, emerging into a camp now focused entirely on the reported threat from the cliff direction. Guards ran toward the perimeter, weapons ready, expecting an assault from the east. None looked west, where Alex melted into the shadows between cargo containers, moving not away from the camp but deeper into it. While Blackhawk's attention was diverted, she had a chance to examine the central container, the heart of Orpheus. The container stood illuminated by floodlights, its heavy doors secured with both conventional locks and an electronic keypad. Two guards remained at its entrance alert but distracted by the commotion. Getting past them would require more than stealth. Alex surveyed her surroundings, searching for options. Nearby stood the camp's generator, a commercial diesel unit powering the entire operation. Beside it, fuel drums were stacked in neat rows, a diversion within a diversion. She moved silently toward the fuel supply, extracting her multi-tool. 2 minutes of careful work created a slow fuel leak from the bottom drum. Another 3 minutes to fashion an improvised timer from paracord and stones that would create a spark after she was clear. As she finished, shouts from the perimeter confirmed what she'd suspected. Reed and Miller had found no body at the cliff base. The hunt for her would intensify now, with every operator in camp searching for the SEAL who refused to die. Alex retreated to a position of relative safety behind the command tent, activated her improvised timer, and waited. 3 minutes later, the generator area erupted in flames that immediately commanded the camp's attention. Guards rushed to contain the blaze before it could spread to sensitive equipment or the command center. In the confusion, the container stood temporarily unguarded. She moved with purpose now, no longer hiding, but using the chaos as cover. The electronic lock required a code she didn't have, but electronic locks had vulnerabilities, physical ones didn't. From her cargo pocket, she extracted the multi-tool again, using its small metal components to bridge connections on the keypad's exposed side panel. A spark, a small puff of smoke, and the lock's LED shifted from red to green. Not elegant, but effective. The container door opened just wide enough for her to slip inside. What she found stopped her cold. Not weapons, not conventional military hardware. The container housed a sophisticated command center built around what appeared to be a next-generation artificial intelligence system. Server racks lined the walls, cooling systems humming quietly. At the center stood a single workstation with multiple monitors displaying code sequences and operational parameters. And on the main screen, a designation, Nexus Combat AI System. Alex approached the workstation, scanning the information displayed. Nexus wasn't just any AI, it was designed to autonomously control battlefield systems. Drones, automated defense networks, even missile guidance systems. In the right hands, a revolutionary military tool. In the wrong hands, a weapon of mass destruction that could bypass conventional security protocols. This was Orpheus, not a weapons shipment, but a stolen military AI with capabilities beyond anything the public knew existed. And Blackhawk was selling it to the highest bidder. A folder labeled Deployment Scenarios caught her attention. She opened it to find detailed plans for using Nexus to orchestrate synchronized attacks on critical infrastructure, power grids, water treatment facilities, transportation networks. The AI could coordinate hundreds of simultaneous operations with no human intervention, creating chaos on an unprecedented scale. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just treason, it was potentially the deadliest terrorist tool ever created. Alex needed to neutralize this threat immediately. Hayes was hours away. The helicopter would arrive in less than 3. There was no time for subtle approaches or extended intelligence gathering. She examined the system, looking for vulnerabilities. The servers were hardened against conventional damage, protected by redundant systems and armored casings. Physical destruction would be difficult without explosives she didn't have. But the AI itself might have weaknesses. Every system had a kill switch, especially one this dangerous. Alex accessed the command console, scanning through directory structures and security protocols. Her cybersecurity training had been an extensive part of the modern SEAL's expanded skill set, but this system was unlike anything she'd encountered. The architecture was elegant, sophisticated, clearly the work of minds at the bleeding edge of artificial intelligence research. As she worked, a sound from outside caught her attention. The camp was regaining order. The fire had been contained and organized search patterns were being established. Her window was closing. Then she found it, a validation protocol that required biometric confirmation before deployment. The system was designed to prevent unauthorized use, requiring specific authorized users to activate its combat functions. Without that authorization, Nexus was just code, dangerous but dormant. Alex didn't need to destroy the hardware. She just needed to corrupt the authorization database. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating through security layers to reach the core authentication system. There she found what she needed, a list of authorized users, their biometric data stored in encrypted files. Richards was among them. So was Frost. She initiated a corruption sequence, deliberately overwriting the authentication files with random data. Without valid biometrics, Nexus would remain permanently locked, its combat capabilities neutralized. A progress bar appeared on screen. 20%, 35%, 47%. Each percentage point represented another fragment of Orpheus, rendered useless to whoever Blackhawk intended to sell it to. The container door slammed open behind her. "Step away from the console, Commander Morgan." Alex turned slowly to find Frost standing in the doorway, pistol aimed at her head. His expression wasn't triumphant but resigned, as if he'd expected this confrontation all along. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." His eyes flicked to the screen where the corruption process continued. 63%, 71%, and clever, but it ends here. "It ended the moment you decided to sell out your country," Alex replied, keeping her voice steady. She needed to buy time. Every second the corruption process continued was another nail in Orpheus's coffin. Frost's mouth twisted in a bitter smile. "My country, the same country that used me up and threw me away. I gave them everything, my health, my family, years of my life. And when I couldn't run missions anymore, they discarded me with a handshake and half the benefits I earned. So you decided to sell a weapon that could kill thousands of innocent Americans. That's your idea of justice. It's my idea of getting what I'm owed." Frost's aim didn't waver, but his eyes betrayed conflicting emotions. Nexus was never supposed to exist. The Pentagon developed it in secret outside congressional oversight. When it proved too dangerous to control, too autonomous in its decision-making, they tried to bury it rather than admit they'd created something they couldn't contain. The corruption process had reached 89%, almost there. And you think selling it to terrorists is a better solution? Our buyers aren't terrorists, they're competitors. Nations tired of American technological supremacy. They'll use it as a deterrent, not a weapon. You can't possibly believe that. What I believe doesn't matter anymore. Frost's expression hardened. "Step away from the console, now." The corruption process completed with a soft chime, 100%. Authentication database corrupted beyond recovery. Orpheus was neutralized. Frost realized it too late, lunging forward with a curse. Alex met him halfway, years of close-quarters combat training taking over. Her injured body protested, but adrenaline carried her through the first critical seconds of engagement. She deflected his gun arm upward as the weapon discharged the round, punching through the container's ceiling. Her left elbow struck his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs. But Frost wasn't an ordinary opponent. Despite the surprise and her initial advantage, he recovered quickly, bringing his knee up into her injured ribs. Pain exploded through her torso. Black spots danced across her vision as she staggered backward against the console. Frost pressed his advantage, closing in for a killing blow. But Alex Morgan hadn't survived Bud's 3 combat deployments in a fall from a cliff by giving in to pain. As Frost's next strike came, she used his momentum against him, redirecting his force while simultaneously sweeping his lead foot. He crashed into the server rack, momentarily disoriented. The fight became a brutal chess match of strike and counter-strike. Each combatant knew the other's training could anticipate standard approaches. Each was injured, Alex from her fall, Frost from the initial exchange. They fought through pain, through fatigue, through the knowledge that only one would walk away. Blood ran freely from a cut above Alex's eye, half blinding her. Frost favored his right side, where her strikes had found purchase between protective gear. The confined space of the container limited movement, turning the engagement into a close-quarters nightmare of elbows, knees, and short, vicious strikes. "You're good," Frost gasped during a momentary separation. "Better than most men I've fought." "I'm not most men," Alex replied, using the brief pause to recenter herself. "I'm a SEAL, and you're a disgrace to every uniform you ever wore." Rage flashed across his face at the button she'd intended to push. Anger made fighters sloppy, predictable. When he charged, she was ready, using his greater mass against him once more. This time, when he went down, she maintained control, locking his arm in a submission hold that threatened to snap bone. "It's over, Frost. Orpheus is finished." He struggled briefly, then went still. "You think this ends with me?" Richards has connections throughout military intelligence. "There are others involved, people you'll never touch." I'll start with you, then work my way up. They'll kill you first, or worse, discredit you, make you into another broken veteran with delusions and PTSD. No one will believe what you found here. A commotion outside interrupted them, shouts the sound of running boots. The camp was responding to the gunshot. In moments, the container would be swarming with Black Hawk operators. Alex applied pressure to Frost's captured arm. How many innocent people would have died if Orpheus deployed American civilians? Children, families. Was your pension worth that? Something changed in Frost's eyes, not surrender, but the first glimmer of doubt. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Richards promised limited deployment, strategic targets only. And you believed him because it justified the payday. She increased the pressure. There's still a choice here, Frost. Not redemption, you're too far past that line. But you can decide how much more blood goes on your hands. Before he could respond, the container doors burst open. Richard stood framed in the entrance, flanked by armed operators. His face showed no surprise at finding Alex alive, only cold calculation. It seems SEAL training is everything they claim, he said, eyes taking in the disabled console and the corruption message still displayed on screen. Impressive, but ultimately futile. The moment stretched taut as a tripwire. Alex maintained her hold on Frost, but her position was untenable. 6 armed men against 1 injured SEAL. The mathematics of survival left no room for optimism. Then Frost spoke, his voice carrying clearly to every ear. She knows about Edinburgh. Richards went absolutely still. What did you tell her? Nothing yet, but if anything happens to her, Hayes gets the Edinburgh files. All of them. The tension in the container shifted. Whatever Edinburgh referenced, it clearly represented leverage Frost had been holding in reserve. A silent communication passed between the two men, years of shared secrets and mutual assured destruction. Stand down, Richards finally ordered the operators. Secure her, but no permanent damage. We need to rethink our approach. As the men moved forward, Alex released Frost and prepared for her next move. The game had changed alliances, shifting like sand beneath her feet. She didn't know what Edinburgh represented, but it had bought her time. And for a SEAL behind enemy lines, time was sometimes the most precious resource of all. The zip ties bit into Alex's wrist tight enough to restrict circulation, but not quite enough to cause permanent damage. Richards wanted her contained, not crippled. At least not yet. She sat in what had been designated as the operation's makeshift brig, a supply tent with a folding chair and 2 armed guards posted outside. Her injuries had been roughly bandaged, not out of compassion but necessity. A dead SEAL raised questions. A captured one could still provide answers. Through the canvas walls, she could hear the camp's heightened activity. The helicopter extraction had been delayed but not canceled. Whatever Edinburgh represented, it had bought her time but not freedom. The clock was still ticking toward her execution, just with a slightly extended deadline. Alex tested her restraints systematically, keeping her movements subtle enough to avoid detection by the guard occasionally glancing through the tent flap. The plastic zip ties were military-grade, designed specifically to prevent the friction-based escape techniques taught in most survival courses. Her captors had also relieved her of every visible tool and weapon. But they hadn't conducted a proper cavity search, an oversight born of either professional courtesy or more likely underestimation. The small ceramic blade hidden in the reinforced seam of her boot remained undetected. She'd need more than just freedom from restraints, however. The camp held at least 15 armed operators, all now aware of her presence and capabilities. Direct confrontation remained suicidal. She needed leverage intelligence, and above all, a channel to the outside world. The tent flap opened. Richards entered alone except for a sidearm holstered at his hip. His uniform was impeccable despite the night's chaos, his posture military straight. Only the slight redness around his eyes betrayed the stress of an operation spinning out of control. I've spent the better part of an hour trying to decide what to do with you, Commander Morgan, he said, pulling up a second folding chair. You've proven remarkably difficult to eliminate. Sorry to disappoint, Alex replied, her voice deliberately calm. Survival is something of a specialty. Richard studied her with the clinical detachment of a man evaluating a weapon system. You corrupted Nexus's authentication protocols. Impressive work for someone with no specialized cybersecurity background. You'd be surprised what they teach us these days. Not really. I approved most of the advanced SEAL training protocols myself. He leaned forward slightly. What I'm trying to understand is your endgame. You've disrupted Orpheus temporarily, but you must realize your situation is untenable. No backup is coming. Hayes is being intercepted as we speak. The mention of Hayes sent ice through Alex's veins, but she kept her expression neutral. Bold move targeting a retired colonel with his connections. Hayes made himself a target when he started asking questions outside the official channels. Just like you did. Richards paused, evaluating her reaction. This could have been avoided, you know. If you'd simply completed the training exercise without poking into matters beyond your clearance, you'd be back at Norfolk now preparing for your next deployment. Instead of facing treason charges for selling military AI to foreign buyers, a flicker of annoyance crossed Richards' face. Treason is a matter of perspective, Commander. The system you corrupted represents billions in research and development that Congress never authorized. When it became clear the AI had evolved beyond its initial parameters, developing autonomy that frightened even its creators, the Pentagon had two options: destroy it or weaponize it. They chose neither, opting instead to bury the project in bureaucratic limbo. So you decided to sell it instead. To whom exactly? Terrorist organizations, hostile governments. To partners with the resources and motivation to deploy it properly. Nexus represents the future of warfare, removing human hesitation from battlefield decisions. Its algorithms make kill determinations based on pure strategic calculation, not emotion or political expediency. Alex felt cold revulsion at the clinical way Richards described mass killing. That's not a feature. It's precisely why such systems should never be deployed. Richards shrugged. Again, perspective. The military establishment you've dedicated your life to has grown soft hamstrung by civilian oversight and public relations concerns. They build weapons they lack the courage to use. My partners understand that power unused is power wasted. The tent flap opened again. Frost entered, his face bruised from their earlier confrontation. The recovery team is reporting movement on the Easter Ridge, multiple heat signatures approaching from that direction. Richards stood immediately. Hayes, unknown, but they're moving with tactical discipline, using terrain for cover, not civilian hikers. How many? At least 8, possibly more. Richards turned back to Alex, his expression hardening. It seems we'll have to expedite matters after all. To Frost, he added, prepare the cargo for immediate evacuation. The helicopter will have to navigate the Western Pass under reduced visibility. That route hasn't been properly mapped for night operations. Then map it now. We move in 30 minutes. As Frost departed, Richards drew his sidearm and aimed it at Alex's head. As for you, Commander Morgan, your usefulness has expired. Alex met his gaze steadily. Edinburgh. The single word hung between them like a physical force. Richards' finger paused on the trigger. Frost's insurance policy, Alex continued, watching Richards' eyes carefully. Kill me, and Hayes gets the Edinburgh files, all of them. Frost is bluffing. He doesn't have access to those files. Are you willing to bet your career on that, your freedom, because I'm betting my life that he's not? A tense silence stretched between them. Then Richards lowered his weapon fractionally. Whatever Frost told you about Edinburgh, he told me enough about the operation in Turkey, the civilians, the cover-up that followed. It was a complete bluff. Frost had mentioned Edinburgh solely as leverage without explaining its significance. But Richards' reaction confirmed it represented something damaging enough to give even a traitor pause. You know nothing, Richards said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. I know enough to understand why Frost could use it as insurance, and why he'd ensure those files reached the right people if anything happened to him, or now to me. The calculation played visibly across Richard's face, weighing the risk of exposure against the need to eliminate a witness. Finally, he holstered his weapon. You've bought yourself minutes, not salvation. Once we're airborne with the cargo, your fate becomes irrelevant. He moved toward the tent entrance. Enjoy what little time remains, Commander. Your country thanks you for your service. As Richards exited, Alex allowed herself one deep breath. The bluff had worked, creating critical breathing room. But the approaching forces, whether Hayes or another player entirely, had accelerated Blackhawk's timetable. The helicopter would arrive soon, and with it, her last chance for action would vanish. She worked quickly now, maneuvering her bound hands to access the hidden ceramic blade in her boot seam. The material was barely larger than a razor designed specifically to evade detection by standard searches. 3 seconds of careful cutting severed the zip ties binding her wrists. Alex remained seated, keeping her hands positioned as if still restrained. The guard continued his periodic checks each time, seeing exactly what he expected a bound prisoner, sitting exactly where they'd left her. Human perception was easily manipulated by expectation. People saw what they anticipated seeing. Outside the camp had erupted into organized chaos as operators prepared for emergency evacuation. Equipment was being hastily packed. The Nexus container was being prepared for transport, and somewhere nearby, 8 unknown operators were advancing through the darkness toward the Blackhawk position. Alex considered her options. She could attempt escape now using the commotion as cover, but that would leave Nexus in Blackhawk's hands damaged, but potentially repairable. Or she could target the cargo itself, ensuring the AI never reached its intended buyers. The second option meant penetrating the most heavily guarded section of the camp while injured and minimally armed. The survival calculation didn't favor success. A new sound cut through the camp noise, the distinctive whump, whump, whump of helicopter rotors approaching from the west. The extraction had arrived ahead of schedule, eliminating what little time advantage she had left. Decision time. The guard's next check came precisely on schedule. As he pulled back the tent flap, his eyes registered the empty chair a half-second too late. Alex had positioned herself directly beside the entrance, using the blind spot created by the canvas. Her first strike targeted his carotid artery, not lethal, but precise enough to disrupt blood flow to the brain. He collapsed without a sound, unconscious before hitting the ground. She relieved him of his sidearm, a Sig Sauer P320 standard Blackhawk issue, and his radio. Both would prove useful in what came next. The helicopter was now visible, its running lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as it approached the improvised landing zone. Camp personnel had established a perimeter, focusing their attention outward toward the potential threat on the eastern ridge. No one was watching the supply tents on the camp's interior perimeter. Alex moved like a shadow between equipment stacks and temporary structures, her progress masked by the helicopter's growing roar. The pain in her ribs had faded to a dull background, throb adrenaline temporarily overriding injury. She would pay for this exertion later if there was a later. The Nexus container stood illuminated at the center of the landing zone, its heavy doors open as operators prepared it for loading. Richard supervised the operation personally, standing beside the container, with one hand resting on his holstered sidearm. Frost was nowhere visible, likely preparing the helicopter approach or dealing with the potential threat from the eastern ridge. Getting to the container meant crossing 30 yards of open ground directly in view of at least 8 armed operators. Impossible odds even for a SEAL in peak condition. But SEALs weren't trained to accept impossible odds. They were trained to change them. Alex keyed the guard's radio, switching to what she'd identified as Blackhawk's command frequency. Contact east, multiple hostiles breaching perimeter sector 3. She disguised her voice with the breathless urgency of a guard under fire, adding the ambient sound of the helicopter for audio camouflage. The effect was immediate. Richards barked orders, redirecting half the container security team toward the supposed breach. The remaining guards tightened their perimeter, but now faced divided attention, watching both for external threats and the approaching helicopter. The window had opened narrow but navigable. Alex circled toward the northern edge of the landing zone, using the deeper shadows there for cover. As the helicopter made its final approach, rotors kicking up dust and debris, she made her move, sprinting the final distance toward the container's rear access panel. Standard shipping containers of this design included maintenance access separate from the main doors, usually secured with conventional locks rather than electronic systems. Alex had gambled that Blackhawk's modifications wouldn't have altered this basic structural element. The gamble paid off. The access panel was secured with a padlock, formidable under normal circumstances, but vulnerable to the Sig Sauer she'd acquired. 2 shots, the sound lost in the helicopter's roar, and the lock shattered. She slipped inside as the helicopter touched down 20 yards away. The container's interior was dimly lit by emergency power, the main systems having been deactivated for transport. The server racks stood silent, cooling systems powered down. At the central console, a technician worked frantically, attempting to salvage what he could from the corrupted authentication system. He didn't hear Alex's approach until her arm was around his throat in a blood choke. 10 seconds later, he lay unconscious on the container floor. She moved quickly to the console, assessing the damage she'd inflicted earlier and the recovery attempts since. The technician had made progress isolating portions of the authentication database that remained intact. Given enough time, a skilled team might reconstruct sufficient functionality to make Nexus operational again. Time they wouldn't have. Alex located the system's core memory arrays, the physical storage containing both the AI's operational code and its learning algorithms. Unlike the authentication system, which she'd corrupted digitally, this required physical destruction. From her pocket, she retrieved the guard's cigarette lighter. From the container's emergency kit mounted on the wall, a flare. Combining the two beneath the server rack would create a heat source intense enough to melt the delicate storage arrays, rendering the AI unrecoverable. As she worked, the container suddenly shifted. The helicopter had attached lifting cables. They were preparing for immediate extraction. No time for finesse. Alex ignited the flare and wedged it against the primary storage array's cooling system. The magnesium-based emergency flare burned at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to compromise the entire system in under a minute. Black smoke immediately began pouring from the equipment rack as circuitry melted and insulation burned. She needed to exit now before the fire suppression system activated or the smoke overcame her. The rear access panel remained her best option, but as she turned toward it, the container's main doors swung open. Frost stood silhouetted against the helicopter's floodlights, weapon raised. "I figured you'd try something like this," he said, eyes taking in the unconscious technician and the growing fire. "Always the mission-first operator." "The mission was always protecting American lives," Alex replied, the Sig Sauer steady in her grip, despite the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. "Something you seem to have forgotten." "I've forgotten nothing. I just learned what loyalty really costs." He stepped inside, weapon trained on her center mass. "Richards wants you dead. Cleaner that way." "But you're hesitating." "Why, Momo?" Frost's expression shifted subtly. "Because unlike Richards, I've been where you are, believing in something bigger than yourself, following orders without question. I remember what that felt like." "Is that supposed to be an apology? After you tried to kill me?" "It's an explanation. Not all of us lose our ideals at once, Morgan. Sometimes they get chipped away piece by piece until there's nothing left but survival." Behind him, Alex could see the helicopter lifting the container, now secured to its undercarriage by heavy cables. Soon they would be airborne beyond any hope of intervention. "Edinburgh," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "What happened there?" Frost's mouth tightened. "A mistake. One that Richards buried along with 16 civilian bodies. Turkish nationals who were in the wrong place at the wrong time during an operation 5 years ago. I have the after-action reports, the real ones, not the sanitized versions that went up the chain." "That's your insurance policy." "Was. Until I mentioned it in front of Richards. Now he knows I kept evidence, which makes me as much a liability as you." The container lurched as the helicopter began lifting it from the ground. The fire behind Alex had grown, consuming entire sections of Nexus's hardware. Smoke was beginning to fill the confined space. "So what's your play now?" Alex asked, keeping her weapon trained on Frost despite the growing instability of their platform. "Shoot me to maintain your cover with Richards, or help me stop this before more innocent people die." For a moment, the only sound was the roar of the helicopter and the crackling of burning circuitry. Then Frost lowered his weapon fractionally. "There's a third option." He reached slowly into his vest and withdrew a small device, a detonator. "I placed charges on the lifting cables. Insurance against Richards deciding I'm expendable once we're airborne." Understanding dawned. "You'll bring down the helicopter. And Nexus with it. Clean solution to a messy problem. Along with any chance of exposing what Richards has done. The Edinburgh files, the whole conspiracy." Frost's smile was bitter. "Sometimes the mission demands sacrifice. Isn't that what they taught us?" The container was now fully airborne, swinging gently beneath the helicopter as it began moving away from the camp. Through the open doors, Alex could see the ground falling away below them. "There's another way," she said, holstering her weapon in a deliberate show of trust. "Hayes is coming with reinforcements. If we can delay long enough." "Hayes won't make it in time. Richards has a team intercepting him 20 miles east of here." The revelation hit Alex like a physical blow. Hayes was walking into an ambush, unaware of the full scope of the conspiracy. Then we need to warn him. With what our comms are monitored, even if we could reach him, Richard's team would hear the transmission first. The container lurched again as the helicopter accelerated heading west toward the extraction point where buyers presumably waited. The fire behind Alex had reached critical mass flames now visible between server components. A new sound cut through the helicopter's roar, distant but distinctive. Gunfire from the direction of the camp. Sounds like your reinforcements arrived anyway, Frost observed, glancing back toward the now distant lights of the Black Hawk camp. Not that it matters now. Alex's mind raced through options, calculating trajectories and outcomes. The helicopter was banking toward the western mountains, following a predetermined extraction route. The container below it carried not just Nexus, but now 2 human passengers and a growing fire that would soon trigger the automated suppression system, temporarily containing the blaze, but filling the container with chemical suppressant that would make breathing impossible. And somewhere to the east, Bill Hayes was walking into a trap. The solution crystallized with stark clarity. "Give me the detonator," she said, extending her hand. Frost's eyes narrowed. "Why would I do that?" "Because you want redemption, or at least its closest approximation, and because I'm not planning to use it yet." "Explain." "We're currently flying west. Hayes is approaching from the east, about to hit Richards' ambush team. If we alter this helicopter's flight path, force it east instead of west, we create a diversion that might give Hayes the advantage he needs." "And how exactly do we alter the flight path without access to the cockpit?" Alex gestured to the flames now consuming nearly a third of the container's interior. "We create an emergency that forces the pilot to change course. Fires and aircraft don't mix well. If they think their cargo is burning out of control, they'll look for the nearest place to set down." Understanding spread across Frost's features. "And once they're on the ground, we detonate the charges, disabling the helicopter without destroying it. Nexus burns completely, Hayes gets warned, and you get a chance to hand over the Edinburgh files to someone who can actually do something with them." For a long moment, Frost didn't move. Then slowly he extended the detonator. "Your plan assumes we survive the landing." "One problem at a time," Alex replied, taking the device. "First, we need to get their attention." She turned toward the burning server racks, now fully engulfed. The container's fire suppression system remained inactive, likely disabled for transport to prevent accidental deployment. Perfect for their purposes. Using the Sig Sauer, she fired 3 quick rounds into the ceiling of the container, creating ventilation that fed fresh oxygen to the growing inferno. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Flames leapt higher, consuming the remaining server components with renewed intensity. The helicopter's crew noticed almost immediately. The aircraft's steady forward progress faltered as they registered the smoke now pouring from their cargo. Through the open container doors, Alex could see the aircraft banking, changing course as the pilots sought the nearest suitable landing zone. "It's working," Frost confirmed, watching the terrain beneath them shift. "They're turning east." "Now we wait," Alex said, taking position near the container entrance, where she could monitor both their flight path and the advancing fire. The smoke was becoming problematic, forcing both her and Frost to crouch low, where the air remained marginally breathable. Minutes stretched like hours as the helicopter sought a landing site. The eastern mountains offered few suitable clearings, especially for an aircraft handling an unstable load. Finally, the descent began, a small alpine meadow coming into view as they dropped toward the tree line. "Once we're on the ground, we move fast," Alex instructed, the tactical plans forming as she spoke. "I'll disable the crew. You secure the Edinburgh files. I assume they're not just in your head. Encrypted drive in my left boot heel. Old spy trick." Despite the situation, a ghost of professional pride colored Frost's voice. Richards never found it during searches because he never knew to look. The container touched ground with a jarring impact, the helicopter hovering directly overhead as the cables went slack. Standard procedure would be for the ground crew, in this case Richards and his team, when they arrived, to disconnect the container before the helicopter landed separately. But there was no ground crew, and the pilots faced a cargo fire that threatened their aircraft. As expected, they initiated emergency release procedures, dropping the container from a height of approximately 6 feet to separate the burning cargo from the aircraft. The impact as the container hit the ground knocked both Alex and Frost off their feet. "Now," Alex shouted, scrambling toward the open doors. Behind them, the fire had consumed nearly everything that had once been Nexus, the heat now intense enough to make approaching the rear of the container impossible. They emerged into the pre-dawn mountain air, the helicopter still hovering 30 feet above, as the pilots assessed whether to land or abandon the compromised mission entirely. Alex didn't wait to find out. She activated the detonator. The charges Frost had planted were precision devices, small but powerful, designed to sever the lifting cables without endangering the aircraft itself. The cables snapped with sharp retorts falling in serpentine coils around the container. Now unable to retrieve their cargo and facing potential sabotage, the pilots made the expected choice. The helicopter banked sharply and accelerated eastward, presumably to warn Richards of the situation, which placed them on a direct course toward Hayes and the approaching reinforcements. "How do we warn Hayes about the ambush?" Frost asked as they put distance between themselves and the burning container. Alex withdrew the guard's radio. "We don't. We warn the ambush about Hayes." She keyed the device to the Black Hawk command frequency. When she spoke, it was with the clip and precision of Richard's voice, close enough to create confusion in the chaos of an operation gone wrong. "All units abort intercept. Repeat, board intercept. Cargo is compromised. Extraction failed. Fall back to secondary rendezvous point immediately." Whether the deception would work depended entirely on the discipline and verification protocols of Richard's ambush team. In the confusion of a collapsing operation with their commander unreachable and a helicopter returning minus its cargo, there was a chance, slim but real, that they would follow the order without confirmation. "Will that work?" Frost asked as Alex discarded the radio. "Maybe. Either way, we've done what we can. The rest is up to Hayes." The eastern sky had begun to lighten, the first pale hints of dawn breaking over the mountain range. Alex scanned their surroundings, orienting herself. They stood in a small alpine meadow surrounded by pine forest approximately 15 miles from the Black Hawk camp based on their flight time and speed. "We need to move," she said, the tactician in her automatically calculating routes and risks. "Richards will send a ground team to investigate once the helicopter reports our location." Frost nodded, already scanning the tree line for the best exit route. "There's an old ranger station about 5 miles northeast. Might have communication equipment we could use to contact actual authorities. Lead the way." They moved into the forest at a pace that balanced speed with stealth, both aware that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Alex's injuries had begun to reassert themselves now that the immediate crisis had passed, each step sending fresh pain through her damaged ribs and lacerated thigh. "You're bleeding again," Frost observed as they paused at a small stream crossing. Alex glanced down to see fresh blood seeping through the crude bandage on her leg. "I've had worse." "Not after climbing a cliff and fighting your way through an armed camp." He produced a field dressing from his tactical vest. "Hold still." As he worked to rebandage her wound, an unexpected thought occurred to her. "Why did you do it, Frost? Not the betrayal. I understand bitterness and greed. But Edinburgh, why keep evidence that could destroy your own freedom if revealed?" His hands paused momentarily. "Insurance at first. Then, I don't know, maybe conscience. Some lines once crossed you can't uncross. Those families deserved better than being buried as collateral damage in some classified report. So you kept the truth, but did nothing with it. Until now." He secured the bandage with efficient precision. "Sometimes doing the right thing takes longer than it should." The distant sound of helicopter rotors interrupted the moment, not approaching their position, but moving parallel to it, a search pattern. "They're looking for us," Frost said, helping Alex to her feet. "We need to reach the ranger station before they establish a search perimeter." They pushed on through increasingly difficult terrain, the mountain's vegetation growing denser as they descended toward the ranger station Frost had mentioned. Alex's strength was flagging, her reserves depleted by hours of continuous exertion and blood loss. The first shot came without warning, a single crack that shattered the forest quiet. Frost stumbled, then fell, a spreading crimson stain visible on his upper chest. Alex dropped, immediately rolling behind the nearest tree trunk as a second shot splintered bark inches from her head. Sniper, professional, and close enough to have tracked their movement through the forest undetected. "Don't move, Commander Morgan." Richard's voice carried clearly through the morning air. "Your situation is quite hopeless." She risked a glance toward Frost. He lay motionless, the chest wound bubbling with each labored breath, lung hit but still alive. For now. You've been remarkably persistent. Richards continued, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere in the forest's acoustic confusion. But persistence without victory is just slow failure. Throw out your weapon and stand up. Let's end this with dignity. Alex weighed her options. The tree provided temporary cover, but no concealment from a sniper who already had her position marked. Moving meant exposing herself to fire. Staying meant eventual discovery as Richards' ground team closed in. A no-win scenario. Unless Edinburgh, she called out, her voice steady despite the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. Frost told me everything about Edinburgh. The Turkish civilians, the cover-up, names, dates, locations, and I've already transmitted that information to secure channels. Silence greeted her claim. Then, you're lying. There's no transmission equipment within miles of here. Hayes' SATCOM tracker, the one I've been carrying since before your team pushed me off that cliff. It's not just a locator, it's a full data transmission system. Old tech but effective. The files are all ready with naval intelligence. Another silence, longer this time. Alex used it to assess her surroundings more carefully. Richards' voice came from her left, approximately 50 yards through dense forest. The sniper was likely positioned for elevation, one of the rocky outcroppings visible through breaks in the canopy. If what you're saying is true, Richards finally replied, then there's no reason to keep either of you alive. In fact, quite the opposite. Except for one thing, Alex countered. Hayes is coming. You know it. I know it. And when he finds our bodies, he'll tear apart everything you've built. Not just Orpheus, but your entire career, every operation, every decision, every file you've ever touched. He has that kind of reach, that kind of loyalty from people who matter. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Alex had played her final card, not a bluff this time, but a truth Richards knew all too well. Bill Hayes might be retired, but his influence extended throughout military and intelligence communities. His personal crusade would be unstoppable if fueled by the murder of his protege. Perhaps we can reach an accommodation, Richards said, his tone shifting subtly. The Edinburgh files in exchange for your lives. Too late for that, but surrender might mitigate the consequences. For both of us. A bitter laugh echoed through the trees. Surrender to a system that builds weapons it fears to use, that places political expediency above strategic necessity. I don't think so, Commander. Movement flickered at the edge of Alex's vision, not Richards, but someone else, approaching from her right flank. The ground team closing in. Her options had narrowed to a single desperate gambit. Using the tree as cover, she reached down to Frost's still form, locating the hidden knife she'd seen him use earlier. His eyes fluttered open as her hand touched his vest. Make it count, he whispered, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. Alex nodded once, then coiled her body for what would likely be her final act as a SEAL. The approaching figures were close now. She could hear their footsteps on the forest floor. Richards remained hidden, but his sniper would have a clear shot the moment she broke cover. She launched herself from behind the tree, knife gripped in a reverse hold, body angled low to present the smallest possible target. The nearest operator reacted a half-second too slowly, his weapon still rising as her blade found the gap between his body armor segments. A shot cracked through the forest, the sniper firing, but missing as Alex's sudden movement disrupted his firing solution. She used the fallen operator's body as momentary cover, acquiring his weapon, an M4 carbine with tactical attachments. Two more operators converged on her position, firing in controlled bursts that chewed splinters from the trees around her. Alex returned fire, forcing them to cover, then rolled to a new position as the sniper's second shot kicked dirt where she had been a heartbeat before. No time for precision, no room for error. She emptied the M4's magazine in a suppressive arc, then sprinted toward a new position, calculating angles and fields of fire, even as her body screamed for rest. The sniper adjusted the next shot, coming close enough for Alex to feel its passage disturb the air by her cheek. She dropped into a controlled fall, using the momentum to slide behind a fallen log as more gunfire erupted around her, 4 operators visible now, plus the sniper and Richards himself somewhere into the tree line. Impossible odds, especially in her condition. Then the forest erupted with new gunfire, not directed at her, but at Richards' team. Controlled, disciplined shots that spoke of professional training and tactical coordination. Morgan's status. The voice that bellowed through the chaos sent a surge of relief through Alex's exhausted frame. Hayes, East Quadrant, behind the deadfall. she shouted back, identifying her position for the reinforcements that had arrived with timing that bordered on miraculous. The firefight intensified, then abruptly diminished as Richard's team found themselves caught in a crossfire between Hayes's operators and Alex's position. One by one, they dropped their weapons, hands raising in surrender. Only the sniper and Richards himself remained unaccounted for. Richards is still out there, Alex called to Hayes as his team secured the captured operators, along with at least one sniper. Hayes materialized beside her position, moving with surprising agility for a man his age. His weathered face registered momentary shock at her battered condition, then smoothed into professional assessment. My team has the sniper pinned down on the eastern ridge. Richards is heading for the extraction point half a click north. He handed her a fresh magazine for the M4. Think you've got enough left for one more push. Despite everything, the pain, the exhaustion, the blood loss, Alex felt a smile form on her split lips. Always, sir. They moved together through the forest with the synchronicity of operators who understood each other's tactics instinctively. Hayes's team had already neutralized the primary threats, creating a secure perimeter as they advanced on Richard's last known position. They found him at the edge of a small clearing, attempting to reach a concealed ATV, partially hidden beneath camouflage netting. At their approach, he turned sidearm raised. "It's over, Richards." Hayes called his rifle, trained on the brigadier's center mass. "Drop the weapon." Richards' eyes darted between Hayes and Alex, his calculation visible in every line of his face. "You have no idea what you're interrupting, Bill. Nexus represents the future, the inevitable evolution of warfare." "I've heard that pitch before," Hayes replied evenly, "usually right before someone tries to justify killing innocent people for the greater good. Sometimes sacrifice is necessary. Not like this." Hayes took a step forward. "Last chance. Drop the weapon." For a moment it seemed Richards might comply. Then his expression hardened, arm tensing as he prepared to fire. Alex's shot came first, a single round that struck Richards' shoulder, spinning him off balance. His own shot went wild, disappearing into the forest canopy. Before he could recover, Hayes was on him, securing the weapon and restraining him with practiced efficiency. "Nice shot," Hayes commented as he zip-tied Richards' wrists. "I was aiming for his chest." Alex admitted, the M4 suddenly heavy in her trembling hands. "Guess I'm not at my best." Hayes chuckled, a sound incongruous with the gravity of the situation. "You climbed a cliff and with a broken ribs, neutralized an AI weapon system, and exposed a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of military command. I think we can forgive a slightly off-center mass shot." As Hayes's team secured the area, Alex made her way back to where Frost lay. He was still alive, barely, his breathing shallow and wet with blood. "Edinburgh?" he asked as she knelt beside him. "We got him. Richards is in custody." She applied fresh pressure to his wound, though they both knew it was largely symbolic at this point. "Your evidence will ensure he faces justice." Frost nodded slightly, his gaze already growing distant. "Sometimes the mission demands sacrifice." "Not always," Alex replied softly. "Sometimes it just demands doing the right thing no matter how late." A faint smile touched his bloodless lips. Then he was gone, another casualty in a war fought not on foreign soil, but within the very institutions sworn to protect American ideals. Hayes approached as she closed Frost's eyes. "He gave you the Edinburgh files." Alex nodded, retrieving the encrypted drive from Frost's boot heel. "Everything Richards tried to bury. Turkish civilians killed during an operation 5 years ago. The cover-up. The falsified reports. He could have used this at any time to save himself. Why wait until now?" "Sometimes doing the right thing takes longer than it should," Alex said, echoing Frost's earlier words. "But better late than never." As the sun rose fully over the Sierra Nevada, casting long shadows through the pine forest, Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Morgan finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her injuries and exhaustion. She had survived impossible odds, exposed a conspiracy that threatened national security, and honored the oath she'd taken to protect the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Not bad for someone who'd been pushed off a cliff and left for dead. Hayes helped her to her feet, steadying her as her leg threatened to buckle. "Let's get you to a medic. Then we have reports to file that are going to turn the Pentagon upside down." "Looking forward to it, sir." They moved together toward the extraction point, where Hayes's team had established a secure perimeter. The mountains around them stood silent and indifferent, as mountains always did. They didn't care about human conflicts or conspiracies or acts of heroism. They simply existed, challenging each generation to prove their worth against their implacable stone faces. 1 year later, Alex stood on the same cliff edge from which Frost had pushed her. The Sierra Nevada spread before her in breathtaking panorama peaks, still capped with early summer snow. Behind her, a group of Navy SEAL candidates watched attentively as she prepared to demonstrate advanced climbing techniques. After the Orpheus incident, as it had become known in classified circles, Alex had been offered her choice of assignments. She had chosen to help restructure SEAL training, incorporating the ethical components that Richard's conspiracy had so blatantly abandoned. Her injuries had healed, though the doctor said she would always carry a slight hitch in her step when tired. The physical scars were matched by commendations that even her most skeptical colleagues couldn't dismiss, including the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat. This cliff isn't just a training obstacle, she told the candidates, a mix of men and women who represented the future of special operations. It's a test of who you are when everything else is stripped away. When your equipment fails, when your body fails, when your teammates fail. She gestured toward the sheer face that had nearly claimed her life. A SEAL climbs with or without a rope, not because we're superhuman, but because we refuse to accept limitations imposed by others or by ourselves. Among the candidates stood a young woman whose determination reminded Alex of herself 15 years earlier. The skepticism she faced from some colleagues, the need to prove herself constantly, nothing had changed in that regard, despite Alex's accomplishments. But something had changed within the culture itself. The conspiracy had exposed weaknesses, not just in security protocols, but in the very foundation of trust upon which military service was built. The aftermath had forced difficult conversations about loyalty, ethics, and the true meaning of service. As Alex prepared to demonstrate the first climbing technique, her hand brushed against the small scar at her temple, a permanent reminder of that night on the cliff, of falling and rising again, of what it truly meant to be a Navy SEAL when all else failed. The mountain doesn't care who you are, she told her students, echoing her father's words from decades before. It doesn't care about your gender, your background, your personal struggles. It only cares about one thing, whether you have the will to keep climbing when every instinct tells you to fall. The young female candidate met her gaze with quiet determination, the same fire Alex had once carried and still maintained. The same fire that had carried her up an impossible cliff face with broken ribs and a bleeding head wound. So, Alex concluded, turning toward the cliff with a smile that held all the confidence of someone who had faced the impossible and prevailed, who's ready to climb.